Earlier this year, I appeared as a guest on the SBS Insight program, My Body, My Choice. Now, despite the fact that I had talked to the producers in advance and corrected the record on air in the pre-record, SBS Insight deliberately and flagrantly aired lies. Now, I complained to the SBS Ombudsman and have received this letter from Amy Stockwell. It won't surprise you to learn that she is lockstep with SBS and the pro-abortion establishment, and that's today on The Dr. Jo Show. Thank you for joining me on the show. I'm so grateful to each of you for following me on this journey and for all of the comments that you write. Please, if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and join our movement. So today we're talking about the program that aired in March, My Body, My Choice by SBS Insight. Now, quick recap. I've done a couple of episodes on this. It was a program that we did as a pre-record for 2 hours. So we sat in a studio and had ample time to discuss all of the issues. Now, it wasn't just about abortion. It covered euthanasia, mandatory vaccination. But the first part of the episode, which they led with, and indeed the bulk of the broadcast, was on abortion. I was the main guest from the anti-abortion perspective. Hannah Ferguson was the main guest from the pro-abortion perspective. Now, in the real version that happened over 2 hours, every time a lie was raised by Hannah Ferguson or by the Ranscog guest or by the show itself, I was given the opportunity to respond and to correct it. But the version that you guys saw, the 55 heavily biased edit that then ended up being shown, cut all of the bits where I actually corrected the record. And although they allowed me time to speak, they deliberately advanced lies around late-term abortion, around popular support for abortion, and around the law on abortion. I immediately went out on YouTube and corrected the record through a series of videos. And I also spoke to the executive producer of SBS Insight, Ross Sheepers. Now, when I spoke to him, he said to me, we weren't airing lies. All of that information that we aired about gestational limits and majority support, we found that via Google, and that actually just blew my mind, as I shared with you in a later episode, that the fact that their actual team of researchers are using Google to work out what the law is on abortion. I said to him, why didn't you look at the primary sources? He said, well, look, this is directly what comes up when you Google when is abortion legal to. Now, as you guys know, if you've been following this show for a while, when you Google when is abortion legal up to in Australia, you actually get an inaccurate answer by Google. And that's because they're relying on the sources, Marie Stopes International, Children by Choice, so two of our biggest abortion lobby groups in this country who are part of the abortion industry. They have deliberately misleading information on their website, which is what Google uses to tell you guys what the law is on abortion. Now, the reality is abortion is legal up until birth and for any reason in Australia, as I told Ross Sheepers on the phone. But he just said to me, look, Jo, we did the best we can and this is what we aired. So the next step for me then has been to take this to the SBS Ombudsman. Now, I didn't have a whole lot of faith in this process because it wasn't an independent ombudsman. It is someone appointed to review SBS by the federal government. Now, her name is Amy Stockwell. And the first thing I note when I get her letter is that she uses the language of the abortion industry. So she said, you primarily complained about the accuracy of a 50-second explainer video about reproductive rights in Australia. Even that language, reproductive rights, is a red flag right there that she's not an impartial observer on the issue of abortion. So she could have said, you complained about a 50-second explainer video about the legality of abortion in Australia, but she chose not to do that. She chose to use the euphemistic language of an industry that seeks to hide behind political slogans to cover up what's really going on. So the language of reproductive justice, abortion care, or reproductive rights, which the SBS Ombudsman Amy Stockwell is using, is a key indicator that she is lockstep with the abortion industry, which we're going to see as we read her letter, but that's a red flag right up front. It led me to Google who is Amy Stockwell, and there isn't a whole lot about her, but what I can see is in 2012, she described herself while writing an opinion piece for the ABC as someone who loves feminism and social policy and who thinks that all of the answers in the world can be found through a unity of those two things. What do you have to be to call yourself a modern day feminist? Well, you have to be hook, line and sinker with abortion, because abortion is the modern day sacrament of the feminist movement. It is the thing that they say is essential for women's rights, women's equality, women's empowerment. Women have to be able to kill their offspring in utero. So when Amy Stockwell, independent arbiter, the SBS Ombudsman who's coming to adjudicate this dispute, I don't think she's coming to it from a objective perspective when she describes herself as a feminist. But let's reserve judgment. Let's have a look at what she actually goes on to say in this letter. So, on the topic of the explainer video, so SBS Insight does a video on air, which is a pre-record, and they played it for us in the studio. At the time, I corrected it, which is something you guys didn't see in the bit that aired on TV. Let's have a look at their explainer video on the laws on abortion in Australia.
For example, Tasmania allows for abortions up to 16 weeks into a pregnancy. Other states allow for longer gestation periods, while the ACT has no limit, so long as approval is granted from a medical doctor.
So that clip is deliberately inaccurate. It says that abortion is only available in Tasmania up until 16 weeks, in other jurisdictions up until a gestational limit, but in the ACT with the approval of one doctor. It conveys the impression that you cannot get an abortion after 16 weeks in Tasmania or after 23 weeks in SA or any of those limits. But in the ACT, you just need one doctor and then you can get an abortion. Now, none of that is actually true. As I laid out for the producers in advance of the show, as I explained in the broadcast, as I said on the phone to Ross Sheepers, the executive producer, after it aired, and as I laid out in my letter to the SBS Ombudsman. But in her letter, let's have a look at what she says. So Amy Stockwell writes in her letter, upon review, the video is duly accurate within the terms of the code. The table of gestational limits that appears in the video accurately reflected the period stated in relevant state legislation. Now, I've actually in my letter given her the legislation. I've given her the relevant provisions in each state and territory, which clearly shows, other than the ACT, that up until a gestational limit, the ones identified in their broadcast, you need one doctor to sign off on the abortion. But after that, including in Tasmania, where they say it's only allowed up until 16 weeks, you can get an abortion with the approval of two doctors right up until birth because there is no upper gestational limit in the legislation. It is very clear from the legislation that abortion is permitted after these gestational limits. There's just an additional criteria of a second doctor. Now, the fact that I pointed this out in advance to the producers, to the executive producer after it aired, and now to the SBS Ombudsman in a letter citing the actual legislation, the fact that she's still coming back and saying, actually, our broadcast is accurate, suggests that they are knowingly and deliberately lying. And why are they so intent on lying about this? Well, it's because the entire abortion industry in our country is built on lies. It's a house of cards. And it's only when we actually start to ask questions and expose it, their only response can be to shut that down, because if people really knew about late-term abortion being legal up until birth and for any reason, they would feel sick. They would be absolutely shocked. And the reality is when she says abortion isn't available after these gestational limits and that's an accurate depiction, well, it's just not, because essentially if I try and think about what she's trying to say here or what the show was trying to say is what they're essentially saying is abortion is illegal up until 16 weeks in Tasmania, but because you need two doctors after that point, it's somehow not allowed. That's essentially what she's saying, that, you know, after these gestational limits, because you need two doctors, it's not allowed. But any kind of surgical intervention would require two doctors in Australia. So imagine if I present to my GP because I've got heart issues and I'm going to need some kind of heart surgery, some kind of heart transplant. The GP's not going to be able to do that, but he's going to be able to approve it and refer me to a specialist who will then look at me, and perhaps a team of specialists. You know, I might need 3 or 4 doctors to approve my heart surgery or my heart transplant. That doesn't mean heart surgery or heart transplants are illegal. It just means that to get a surgical intervention in this country, as it should be, there are further checks, further steps that you have to undergo, that you can't just walk up to a hospital and say, you know, give me heart surgery. The same with abortion. So abortion is allowed with one doctor's approval after 16 weeks. You can go to your GP and get that approved. But to kill your baby after that point in any jurisdiction other than the ACT, which allows it up to birth with one doctor's approval, but in every other jurisdiction where you need 2 doctors, it is inaccurate to say that it is not allowed after those gestational limits or that it is illegal. In fact, in Queensland and Victoria between 2010 and 2020, there have been 4,929 babies killed late in pregnancy through a late-term abortion. nearly 1 in 2 of those babies were perfectly healthy, had nothing wrong with them. Clearly, in those jurisdictions, it is possible, indeed allowed, indeed legal, to get an abortion after the gestational limit identified in the video by SBS. Amy Stockwell would have us believe that something goes from legal and allowed to illegal and not allowed simply because there's a few extra layers of process. So, it's illegal to drink in this country just because I have to show my ID when I go and get a 6-pack of beer, or it's illegal to drive just because I need to go through some red tape in order to get a driver's license. You can see how completely insane and incoherent this analysis is by Amy Stockwell. Who is this woman that has been appointed by the federal government to be the arbiter of truth and accuracy in reporting for SBS? Now, in case you still don't believe me, that abortion is legal up until birth in Australia for any reason, let's just have a look at some of the data that's actually released by state governments. So in South Australia, in this table, table 6 of the annual aborting reporting committee's reports that the SA government gives, what we can see is that between 7th of July and 31st of December 2022, there were 10 babies that were killed after 22 weeks and 6 days. So according to SBS, you can't get an abortion after 22 weeks and 6 days in South Australia. That's the gestational limits table that they broadcast to a national audience. But the data from the government clearly shows that actually 8 babies who were perfectly healthy were killed in a late-term abortion in South Australia, and 2 for a fetal anomaly by doctors. So this was clearly legal. According to SBS Insight, all of these doctors were acting illegally outside the realm of the law, but that is actually not the case, because under the Termination of Pregnancy Act in South Australia, it is acceptable to kill a baby after they are viable, after the limit that SBS Insight presents. And in case you're thinking that's just South Australia, well, look at the data from Victoria. So this is 2020 in Victoria. This table, which is table 2.22 of the Consultative Council on Obstetric and Paediatric Mortality and Morbidity, which is produced by Victorian Health, it clearly shows that there were 170 stillbirths. So these are babies after 20 weeks and up until birth. Again, Amy Stockwell would have you believe it's illegal. But in Victoria, 170 of them were killed for a suspected or confirmed congenital abnormality, so some kind of disability that is confirmed or suspected, and 129 of them were killed for a psychosocial reason. So let's be really clear, that's not to save the mother's life. It is for a reason that affects the mother's well-being. It could be insecure housing. In one video, I've shown you how it could even be something as bad as a haircut. She gets a bad haircut. She tells other people about it. They respond negatively and say, oh, it looks bad. In the literature, that could literally be a psychosocial reason. So, what we can see from just South Australia and Victoria is that babies are clearly being killed late in pregnancy. In fact, check this out. Here's a 37-weeker killed in Victoria in 2011 for a psychosocial reason. So healthy baby, physically healthy mum whose life is not at risk, and that baby was injected with poison into the heart and delivered stillborn. Amy Stockwell would tell you it's illegal to do that in Victoria, as would SBS Insight, but it's not. The second area of complaint that I raise with Amy Stockwell as the SBS Ombudsman is the representation of popular support for abortion. Let's look at the clip that SBS Insight aired.
Majority of Australians have supported the legislation of abortion in some form since the 1980s. Studies show support for abortion today is between 70 and 80%.
As I raised with Amy Stockwell, the heading there, most Australians support the legislation, is just inaccurate. There actually hasn't been a robust study of whether Australians support the abortion up to birth laws that exist. In fact, given that the case for abortion up to birth was introduced under a smokescreen, under a lie of decriminalisation, and the abortion industry and the politicians that were working with them were never upfront about the fact that what they were really bringing in was abortion up to birth for any reason. They said it was about ensuring women would not go to jail or be penalised or prosecuted. So they used decriminalisation to bring in abortion up to birth. There's never been a study of whether Australians support the legislation. And yes, SBS Insight clearly has on the screen most Australians support the legislation. Now, I raised this with Amy Stockwell, as I did with the producers in advance, as I did with Ross Sheepers, the executive producer, after the episode. You sort of feel like you're going nuts with the amount of conversations you're having with people, telling them this is not true. And then they still come back. They still come back with the lie. Let's look at what Amy Stockwell says. The host's introduction and the video noted the majority of Australians support for abortion in some form, which is consistent with surveys of public attitudes, including those conducted by Ipsos and reported elsewhere by SBS, which you referred to in your complaint. So basically she's gaslighting me again and just saying it's not true. When I know, and you know, because I've just shown you the clip, what they aired was that most Australians support the legislation. Now, that's never been surveyed. And indeed, what has been surveyed is Australian attitudes about different gestational limits. So while it would be true and accurate to say most Australians support abortion at 6 weeks, because Ipsos does an annual poll, and that is at about 74%. 74% of Australians support abortion at 6 weeks. That same poll says that at 20 weeks, only 39% of Australians support abortion. So if we actually did a survey of 20 weeks up until birth, that number of 39%, which already is not majority support for abortion at 20 weeks, it would dramatically decrease because Australians wouldn't be okay with killing babies after viability through injecting them in the heart and delivering them dead. Australians, if this was explained to them, would support delivering those babies alive. It's just that the abortion industry with the media has covered this up so effectively that most Australians don't know about it. But even so, their claim that most Australians support the legislation, it's just not backed up by the facts. The next thing that the show does is it airs lies about late-term abortion. Let's watch.
Today, much of the debate is centred around late-term abortion, which is any abortion that occurs after 20 weeks. Studies show this accounts for around 1% of all abortions in Australia.
Now, in that clip, SBS Insight perpetuates the lie that late-term abortions are rare because they account for less than 1% of all abortions. I raised this in my complaint to Amy Stockwell. Look at her reply. She says, the claim that late-term abortions account for around 1% of all abortions in Australia is consistent with evidence presented to a 2024 Queensland parliamentary inquiry by the Australian and New Zealand College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, the peak body for medical experts in this field. So SBS is relying on a quote from a submission that Ranscog has written to a Queensland inquiry. Now, that Queensland inquiry was last year. It was into the issue of babies who survive their abortion and whether they should be entitled to an equal right to care under the law. Ranscog was opposing this and saying, no, these babies should be left to die. And in that submission, as part of that barbaric position that they took, they said late-term abortions are extremely rare. They account for less than 1%. Now, I've looked at the Ranscog submission, and what you can see is they don't even provide a footnote for this claim. So this supposed arbiter of the truth, SBS Ombudsman Amy Stockwell, is literally using an unsubstantiated line by a pro-abortion lobbyist group to verify the claim that late-term abortions account for less than 1%. Because I've been doing a lot of research in this area, I actually know the reference that the abortion industry uses when they make this 1% claim. It comes from a 2004 survey done by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and that is actually the reference for why there's less than 1% of abortions being late term. But the thing that we all need to be aware of is that in 2004, there was no jurisdiction that allowed abortion up to birth for any reason. In 2008, the Victorian jurisdiction became the first one to introduce a law, the Abortion Law Reform Act of Victoria, 2008, that allowed abortion after viability, after 24 weeks and up until birth for a psychosocial reason. Now, after Victoria did that, that got rolled out in Tasmania, Queensland, New South Wales, WA, the Northern Territory and South Australia. The rest is history. It is now legal up till birth for any reason in all of these places. But in 2004, when that 1% statistic was created and has since been cited by everybody from Ranscog to now Amy Stockwell, the SBS Ombudsman, abortion up to birth wasn't actually legal for the very wide range of reasons that it is legal for now. So for her to say, oh, well, I'm just relying on the medical experts, Ranscog, it just doesn't actually work, does it? I mean, who is this person? Is she meant to be an actual arbiter? Like, am I able to give this person a complaint and present my data and evidence and then she looks into it impartially and objectively, actually doing research? Or is she just a mouthpiece for the abortion industry and the left-wing media establishment, going back to the very self-serving claims that are unsubstantiated and based on shonky data by Ranskog, by the abortion industry, and then uses that to come back to me and say, actually, we were fine, we got it right, we were accurate? I mean, it just shows you what we're up against when we're engaging in these spaces, that they set the rules, they control what's true and what's false. And then when you come to them and tell them it's not true and accurate, they just use the same shonky data and lies to tell you that you're wrong. So think about it like this. I go to Amy Stockwell, the so-called arbiter of what's true and accurate, and say to her, SBS Insight has been doing something dodgy because they've relied on shonky data by Ranskog to say that late-term abortions account for less than 1% in Australia. She then turns around and says, okay, I'll look into it. And she goes to that same shonky data used by Ranskog. And then she comes back to me and says, actually, it's true because Ranskog says it is. You can see how nuts this is. And then the final area of my complaint against SBS Insight is what they aired around late-term abortion. They gave Hannah Ferguson, who's not a medical expert, no one ever seems to troll her for the fact that she's clearly not a medical doctor. And in fact, what she goes on to say in this excerpt about late-term abortion and the reasons for late-term abortions is completely untrue. And I corrected in the broadcast. You guys don't get to see that because of the heavily biased edit. But when I complained to Amy Stockwell, she, surprise, surprise, is lockstep with Hannah Ferguson and the abortion industry. Let's first take a look at what Hannah Ferguson said.
Specifically late-term abortion, part of my concern is that so much of the political and legal focus on it and the drive for it to be in the centre of the media distorts the reality of how many people actually have late-term abortions, which account for less than 1% in this country, I believe, and in South Australia. So when we drive the narrative of late-term abortion right into the mainstream media, I think we're distorting the reality of how many people actually experience it and why they make those decisions. Because I think when we frame it as a decision instead of a healthcare choice made under duress in often extreme circumstances to do with the fetal health or the pregnant person's health, I think that we instead confuse the population who see the language of 20 weeks, 27 weeks, and think that a person's just willy-nilly accidentally fallen into this and made an error of judgment, when in fact it's often an emergency healthcare decision.
Amy Stockwell replies to me and says, the evidence also supports claims made by another guest on the program that late-term abortions are often an emergency healthcare decision or made under duress and in extreme circumstances. Now, I raised with Amy Stockwell that you never need an abortion, a late-term abortion, in an emergency. And if we look at the data from SA Health, because they give the best data on this, we can see that there's actually 0 late-term abortions to save the mother's life. The reason for that is because if a mother's life was truly at risk, so she's got preeclampsia and her life is at risk, it's a severe form, or she's got some other kind of life-threatening condition in pregnancy, late in pregnancy, the doctors are not going to go in and do a late-term abortion, because as this procedure shows from a Sydney hospital, a late-term abortion takes 12 to 48 hours, because the first thing you have to do is go in with a needle after the mother's under general anaesthetic and inject the baby's heart with potassium chloride. That process takes a couple of hours because you have to verify the baby's dead. You then give the mum labour-inducing drugs and she delivers that baby dead. But that whole process of giving her labour-inducing drugs and delivering the baby dead, that takes another 12 to 48 hours because labour can go for a very long time. If a mother's life was truly at risk, so if this was really about an emergency health decision, as Hannah Ferguson and Amy Stockwell and SBS Insight seem to suggest, the only thing that would be done if a mother's in an emergency, a genuine emergency late in pregnancy, they would do a C-section to get the baby out in less than an hour. They would not waste time killing the baby first and delivering the baby stillborn. So when Amy Stockwell comes to me and said, well, this was entirely accurate and consistent with what Ranskog and this guest has said, well, this is just gaslighting, plain and simple. She then goes on to say, I appreciate you do not find this information compelling or expressed in a way you agree with. No shit, Amy. The factual claims are, however, supported by evidence from relevant and authoritative sources, studies and experts upon which it was reasonable for SBS to rely. So essentially what they're saying there is, because everybody agrees with us, it must be true. And, that's where this whole thing feels really, really challenging for someone like me, because they have the abortion establishment. They've captured the medical peak bodies, Ranskog and AMA, because they've got the media establishment and the political establishment all wedded to this idea of abortion up to birth for any reason because it's in the best interests of women. Then someone like me or you who's questioning the narrative and actually bringing out the legislation and the data. So I'm not relying on just conjecture. I'm bringing the primary sources, the legislation that has been passed in all of our states and territories, and the data that's released by state government health departments. But even when I present that to them, they turn around and say, well, actually, we complied with our code. This was an accurate broadcast because we relied on the experts who are just the pro-abortion establishment. So she then says at the end, look, if you don't agree, you can take this to the Australian Communications and Media Authority, and that will be our next step. But I'm not holding my breath because we can now see what we are truly up against in this country. Thank you for watching, and that's today on The Dr. Jo Show.